His wife slapped his hand away from his own divorce papers at his own dinner table in his own house, while her boyfriend sat in his chair and told him the help doesn't get a moment. What none of them knew, not his wife, not her brother, not the billionaire CEO sitting at the head of that table wearing cufflinks that should have told the whole story, was that the quiet man they had spent 6 years treating like furniture was the single human being on earth with the legal power to bring that CEO's entire $29 billion empire to its knees. Not because of anything he had done, because of what his father had signed 40 years ago in a field in East Texas on a piece of paper nobody had bothered to steal properly. They humiliated a man they thought had nothing. What they didn't know was that he had everything. Sitting in a lockbox in his truck, under a rain jacket, collecting dust, waiting. What happens when the man you treated like the help turns out to own the house? If you already know this one is going to be good, go ahead and hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming. Drop your city in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from today. This community is everywhere and we love to see it. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started, to a Sunday evening in Sugar Land, Texas, a dinner table set by hands that deserved better, and the exact moment a quiet man looked down at a pair of cufflinks and understood, for the first time, exactly what his father had been trying to tell him. The table was set before they arrived. Darnell had seen to that. He had ironed the white linen cloth that morning, the one Yvette's mother had given them as a wedding gift, and never expected him to know how to use. He had seasoned the oxtails the night before, let them sit in the refrigerator overnight the way his father had taught him, low and slow with thyme and allspice, and a bay leaf tucked against the bone. The cornbread was in the cast iron. The collards had been going since noon. The sweet tea was already poured into the good glasses, the ones Yvette only brought out when company was coming. Darnell had known company was coming. He just hadn't known what kind. He heard the car doors first, 3 of them in quick succession, the heavy thud of an expensive vehicle. Then the sound of Yvette's laugh, the performance laugh, the one she used when she wanted someone to think she was effortless. Darnell set the last fork down on the table and stood at the edge of the dining room, dish towel over his shoulder, and waited. They came through the front door like they owned it. Yvette first, in a dress Darnell had never seen, something cobalt blue that moved when she walked. Then Terence, her brother, his collar open, a blazer that cost more than Darnell's truck payment, his eyes sliding over Darnell the way they always did, like he was part of the furniture, like he was the help that came with the house. And then the third man, taller than Terence, silver at his temples, the kind of man who had been told his whole life that every room he entered was already his. Yvette did not introduce anyone. She walked to her chair at the far end of the table, the chair Darnell had pulled out for her 1,000 Sunday evenings before this one, and she sat down without looking at him. Terence took his seat. The third man, Darnell would learn his name was Raymond Voss, though no one would offer it tonight, settled into the chair at the head of the table. Darnell's chair. Nobody said a word about it. Darnell went back to the kitchen and brought out the food. He served them the way he had always served this family, quietly, completely, without complaint. The oxtails, the cornbread, the collards. He filled their glasses. He brought out the hot sauce Terence liked without being asked. He stood in his own kitchen and made sure every plate was full before he sat down at the one remaining chair, the one pushed slightly to the side, the one that had always been close enough to serve and far enough to ignore. Terence looked at Darnell's work shirt and smiled the way people smile at something beneath them. "You come straight from the hospital, D?" He said hospital the way some people say janitor. They got you on the late shift now?" Darnell did not answer. He reached for his fork. "I heard they gave the supervisor position to somebody else," Terence continued, cutting into his oxtail. "That's a shame, really." He didn't sound like it was a shame. Raymond Voss said nothing. He ate with the economy of a man who has been served all his life. He was halfway through his plate before he looked up, looked at Darnell directly for the first and only time, and said, "Could you get some more bread?" Darnell got the bread. When he came back to the table, Yvette had something in her hand, a manila envelope, thick, crisp at the edges. She set it on the table between them the way you set down a card in a game you've already won. She slid it toward him slowly, deliberately, with one finger, her eyes finding his for the first time all evening. "I need you to sign those before the end of the month," she said. Darnell looked at the envelope. He reached for it with both hands, began to pull it toward him, to open it, to read what his marriage had been reduced to understand what was being taken and what was being offered, and what, if anything, remained. Raymond Voss reached out and placed one hand flat on the envelope. "The help doesn't get a moment," he said. He said it quietly, almost pleasantly, like it was a fact of nature, like gravity, like weather. Yvette's hand came down on top of Darnell's, not gently. She slapped it away from the papers. The sound cracked through the dining room like something breaking. Terence looked at his plate. Raymond reached for his water glass. Yvette sat back in her chair like nothing had happened. Darnell sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up. He picked up his dish towel from his shoulder and folded it once, twice, and set it on the table beside his plate. He pushed his chair in. He picked up his keys from the counter. He was almost to the door when something caught his eye. Raymond Voss's wrists resting on the table, and on his left cuff, glinting under the dining room light, a small pair of cufflinks. Gold, shaped like oil derricks, miniature and precise, with a tiny crossbeam across the top. Darnell had seen those before. Not on a man's wrist, in a photograph. Black and white, curled at the corners, sitting on his father's workbench in East Texas for as long as Darnell could remember. His father's hands, younger and rougher, holding a pen above a set of papers, and on the table beside the papers, a pair of cufflinks that caught the light just like that. Darnell stood at the door for 1 full second longer than necessary. Then he walked out to his truck, got in, and closed the door behind him. He sat in the dark of his own driveway and looked at his hands. The night was quiet. The engine was off. He did not cry. He was thinking about a lockbox he had carried in this truck for 6 years and never once opened. A lockbox full of his father's papers, a lockbox his father had told him to keep, a lockbox he had never felt any reason to open until right now. Darnell Washington had grown up understanding that a man's worth was in his hands. His father Curtis had taught him that. Not with speeches, but with demonstration. The way Curtis would come home from the oil fields with dirt so deep in his knuckles it looked like it had been painted there, wash up at the kitchen sink, sit down to supper, and say grace like a man who had earned every word of it. Work was dignity. Dignity was work. That was the Washington family theology, and Darnell had carried it north to Houston like a second skin. He had spent 11 years at St. Catherine's Medical Center, keeping the building alive the way a body needs a spine. Boilers, HVAC systems, electrical panels, busted water lines at 2 in the morning. Darnell handled all of it without complaint and without ceremony. His co-workers trusted him. His supervisor had tried to promote him twice. He attended church at Greater Harvest Baptist. Every Sunday he wasn't on call, sang bass in the 3rd pew, brought sweet potato pie to the bereavement committee without being asked. In the Third Ward, where he had grown up, people spoke his name the way they spoke about the neighborhood itself, steadily, with quiet respect. He was not what the Price family had expected their daughter to bring home. Yvette's people were Riverside Terrace old money, the kind that had been polished so long it looked like new. Her father, Eldridge Price, had built a small insurance empire in the 70s and spent the decades since making sure everyone within 50 miles knew about it. Her mother, Gloria, wore pearls to the grocery store and described people she didn't respect as being quote-unquote well-meaning. When Yvette brought Darnell to their home for the first time, Gloria had looked at his hands the way a jeweler looks at a counterfeit coin. A long, deliberate assessment that ended in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They were never cruel to his face. They were something worse. They were politely unconvinced. Over 6 years of marriage, Yvette had absorbed her family's verdict like water absorbs dye, slowly, completely, until it was indistinguishable from her own color. She began correcting Darnell in public. His grammar, his clothes, the way he held his fork at her family's dinner table. She stopped inviting him to the Price family gatherings, then stopped mentioning them at all. She described him to her friends. He had overheard this exactly once at a birthday party in their own backyard, as someone she had been young enough to think was enough. Terence was the one who kept the wound open. Yvette's brother was 3 years older, louder, and constitutionally incapable of entering a room without reorganizing everyone's perception of themselves. He called Darnell D, always D, the way you nickname something you don't think deserves its full name. He made jokes about Darnell's salary at holiday dinners that weren't quite jokes. He told Yvette, repeatedly and in different configurations, that she had married below the line. He used the phrase potential she wasn't living up to so often that Yvette eventually began using it herself. Darnell absorbed all of it. He did not argue, he did not sulk. He went to work, kept the building running, came home, cooked dinner, carried himself like a man who knew exactly who he was, even when everyone around him seemed committed to telling him otherwise. His one concession to grief was the phone calls. Every Sunday evening after church and before supper, he would sit in his truck in the driveway and dial his father's old number. Curtis Washington had been dead 3 years by then, but the voicemail still connected. The recorded voice was still warm, and Darnell would talk to it, not long, never long, just enough to feel tethered to someone who had always known his worth without being told. The lockbox sat under the back seat. He had loaded it from his father's house the week after the funeral, along with the workbench tools and the photograph and a cardboard box of paperwork he had never sorted. He told himself he would get to it. He never got to it, but he kept it. Curtis had been adamant about the keeping. Every document, every receipt, every paper that had ever carried the Washington name. Darnell didn't know why. He had learned not to question the things his father was adamant about. Yvette stopped wearing her wedding ring to Terence's events 18 months before the Sunday dinner. She said it was because the setting scratched things. She said it casually, in passing, the way you mention weather. Darnell looked at her bare hand across the car console and did not say a single word. He already knew. He had known for a while. What he didn't know yet was that Yvette's sudden boldness had a source, that her renewed contempt for everything Darnell was had been carefully irrigated by her brother, who had a very specific reason for needing Yvette to be available, impressive, and attached to someone with significantly more social reach than a hospital facilities manager. Raymond Voss had not stumbled into Yvette's life. He had been delivered there by Terence, on purpose. And the reason had nothing to do with his sister's happiness. and everything to do with 3 over-leveraged properties and a business arrangement that was beginning to look less stable than Terence had originally calculated. Terence had been wrong about one thing above all others. He had told Raymond Voss that Darnell Washington was not a factor. He had said it with the confidence of a man who had spent years studying Darnell and concluded, based on everything visible, that there was nothing underneath. What Terence had never understood, what none of them had ever understood, was that the most dangerous thing in the world is a quiet man with a locked box he hasn't opened yet. The asset disclosure form from Yvette's divorce attorney arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning. It was 12 pages long. It asked for everything: bank accounts, vehicles, property, any financial instruments, any inherited assets. Darnell sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and read every line. When he got to the section marked Inherited Real Property and Mineral Interests, he set the form down. He sat there for a long time. Then he went out to his truck. The lockbox was exactly where it had always been, wedged behind the back seat beneath a rain jacket and a pair of jumper cables. It was a grey metal fire-resistant box, the kind you buy at a hardware store, with a combination lock Curtis had set to the last 4 digits of his mother's birthday. Darnell had known the combination since he was 12 years old. He had just never had a reason to use it. He carried the box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and opened it. The first thing he saw was the note. It was written on a piece of lined paper torn from a spiral notebook in his father's large, deliberate handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write carefully because he knew his signature was going to matter someday. The note said, "Boy, if this ever matters, find somebody who can read what I couldn't." Darnell read it twice. Then he looked at what was beneath it. There were 2 sets of documents held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. The first set was dated 1987, a partnership agreement between Curtis James Washington and Harold Eugene Voss, establishing an entity called Voss Grant Extraction, LLC. Darnell read it slowly, carefully, the way his father had always told him to read anything before he signed it. He saw his father's name. He saw the acreage, 4,400 acres in Nacogdoches County, East Texas. He saw the equity allocation, 18% founding interest to Curtis Washington. He saw Harold Voss's signature, large and looping, next to his father's smaller, steadier one. The second set was dated 1994. It was longer, more complex, full of language Darnell could not fully parse. But he could see his father's signature at the bottom of the last page, and he could see that whatever had been signed in 1994 had something to do with a restructuring of the original agreement. He photographed every page with his phone, both sets, front and back, in good light, every document accounted for. Then he called the hospital union office and asked the rep who handled legal referrals if she knew a property attorney. She gave him a name without hesitation: Patricia Odom, downtown off Millam Street. She said Patricia had gone up against energy companies before and won. Darnell called that same afternoon. He had an appointment by Thursday. Patricia Odom's office was on the 14th floor of a building that smelled like good wood and serious money. Her receptionist offered him water. Patricia herself came out to meet him in the lobby. A tall woman in a charcoal suit, natural hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head, the kind of composed that came from decades of being the smartest person in rooms that hadn't wanted her there. She shook Darnell's hand and led him back to her office without small talk. He laid the photographs out on her desk in order. He did not explain. He simply let her read. Patricia Odom read the 1987 partnership agreement the way a surgeon reads a scan, methodically, without expression, touching nothing. She turned to the 1994 restructuring documents. She read those more slowly. At one point she stopped, went back 2 pages and read a section a second time. Then she took her reading glasses off her head, put them on her face, and read that section a third time. She asked Darnell to sit down. She pulled up something on her computer. She typed for 30 seconds. She turned the monitor so he could see it. It showed the current market capitalization of Voss Integrated Systems, $29.4 billion, as of that morning's close. She said the 1994 restructuring has 3 deficiencies that are fatal under Texas partnership law. The mineral rights on the original acreage were never properly transferred out of your father's name. They passed to you at his death. They are yours. She paused. And the equity position your father held in the 1987 agreement was never legally extinguished. The restructuring documents are defective. 18% of the founding entity passed to you as well. She did the math on a notepad and turned it toward him. $5.2 billion. Darnell looked at the number. He did not speak for a long moment. He was not thinking about what he could buy. He was thinking about his father coming home with dirt in his knuckles, saying grace over supper, working until his back gave out, dying without knowing that the paper he had kept, the paper he had told his son to keep, was worth more than anything Harold Voss's family had ever built without stealing it first. He looked up at Patricia Odom. "What do I do first?" he asked. She closed her notepad. Her voice was steady and certain, like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this question. "First," she said, "we protect the asset, then we move." Patricia Odom did not waste time. The morning after Darnell's first appointment, she called him at 6:45 while he was getting ready for his shift. She told him she had been up since 4. She told him she had pulled the Nacogdoches County property records, the Texas Secretary of State filings for Voss Grant Extraction, LLC, and the complete corporate history of Voss Integrated Systems going back to its founding entity. She told him that everything she had found confirmed what the documents showed. Then she told him what they were going to do about it. The first order of business was the trust. Patricia explained it plainly the way she explained everything. No theatre, no unnecessary words. The divorce proceeding had created a window of legal exposure. Any asset Darnell held in his own name could potentially be argued as marital property subject to division. The mineral rights, the equity claim, all of it. The way to close that window was to move everything into a properly structured trust before any divorce judgment was entered, and to do it immediately while the timeline was still clean. She had the trust documents drafted within 48 hours. Darnell came back to her office on a Wednesday evening after his shift, still in his work clothes, and sat across from her desk while she walked him through every page. The entity was named the Curtis Washington Family Trust. Darnell was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary. The mineral rights to the 4,400 acres in Nacogdoches County were transferred in. The equity recovery claim, as a legal right of action, was assigned to the trust as well. Patricia filed the trust instrument with Harris County that same evening. It was now 14 days after the Sunday dinner. Whatever Yvette's attorneys tried to claim going forward, they would be reaching into an empty hand. Patricia then turned to the litigation teams. She had retained 2 separate groups, a deliberate choice. The first was a Nacogdoches County land and title firm with 30 years of experience in East Texas mineral rights disputes. Their assignment was the quiet title action, a formal legal proceeding to establish Darnell's ownership of the mineral rights in the public record, permanently and without ambiguity. The second team was a Harris County commercial litigation group that had successfully prosecuted 3 partnership fraud cases in the past 5 years. Their assignment was the equity recovery action against Voss Integrated Systems. Patricia's instructions to both teams were the same: move precisely, move quietly, and do not telegraph anything before the filings land. She sat Darnell down before he left that evening and gave him his own instructions. Do not call Yvette. Do not call Terence. Do not respond to any communications from their attorneys beyond what was legally required. Do not tell anyone at work, at church, or anywhere else what was happening. Show up Monday morning at St. Catherine's, work his shift, come home, and let the legal machinery do what legal machinery was built to do. His job, she said, was to be invisible. He had been invisible for 6 years. He could manage 2 more weeks. Darnell almost smiled at that. He drove home that night with his father's voice somewhere in the back of his head, the way it always surfaced when things got quiet. Still water runs deep, boy. Curtis had said it so many times it had become like a proverb in their household, a family commandment passed down without explanation. Darnell had always understood it as patience. Sitting with it now, driving through the dark streets of the Third Ward with a $5.2 billion legal claim filed in his name, he understood it was something more than that. Still water doesn't look like much from the surface. That's the whole point. He went to work Monday. He fixed a cooling unit on the 3rd floor that had been giving the nursing staff problems for a week. He ate lunch in the break room with Miss Claudette, who watched him over her sweet tea with the careful eyes of a woman who had raised 4 children and could tell when something had shifted in a person. She did not ask. He did not volunteer. He finished his shift, signed out, drove home, and slept better than he had in 6 years. Meanwhile, Patricia's teams were moving. The quiet title action was filed in Nacogdoches County District Court on day 11. It was a matter of public record, but it was buried in the county's property dispute docket alongside dozens of other filings. Nothing about it announced itself. There was no press release. There was no notification to Voss Integrated Systems beyond what Texas law required, a formal legal notice sent by certified mail to the company's registered agent in Austin. The trespass and extraction notice went out the same day. It was a single-page document precisely worded, informing Voss Integrated Systems that it was operating an active drilling operation on land it did not legally control, extracting reserves from mineral deposits it had no valid lease to access, and that all such activity must cease immediately pending resolution of the title dispute. Certified mail, no drama, no phone calls, no warnings. On day 14, Patricia filed the equity recovery action in Harris County District Court. The filing attached the original 1987 Voss Grant Partnership Agreement, a certified copy of the 1994 restructuring documents, and a 47-page legal analysis detailing every deficiency in the restructuring under Texas partnership law. It named Voss Integrated Systems as the defendant and sought full restoration of Curtis Washington's 18% founding equity, valued, as of the date of filing, at $5.2 billion. The filing was public record the moment it hit the docket, and somewhere across Houston, in a glass and steel tower that his grandfather had built on stolen ground, Raymond Voss's general counsel was opening his morning mail. The first envelope arrived at Voss Integrated Systems on a Tuesday morning. Raymond's general counsel, a careful man named Gerald Pruitt, who had spent 20 years keeping the Voss family's legal exposure contained, opened it at his desk before Raymond arrived at the office. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he picked up his phone and told his assistant to clear Raymond's calendar for the rest of the day. The news was not complicated. It was devastating in its simplicity. Voss Integrated Systems had no valid lease on the 4,400 acres in Nacogdoches County The mineral rights holder had been identified. He had retained counsel. All drilling activity on the site was to cease immediately pending resolution of the quiet title action now filed in Nacogdoches County District Court. The trespass and extraction notice was legally binding. The drilling operation shut down within 72 hours. Raymond's reaction was disbelief, pure, clean disbelief. He told Gerald it was a clerical error. He told him to find the lease documents. Gerald told him quietly and with the composure of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis that there were no lease documents. There had never been a formal lease. The site had operated on a verbal agreement with a man named Curtis Washington, who had died in 2019, and no one had thought to formalize anything with his heir. The heir's name was Darnell Washington. Raymond went very still when he heard that name. The drilling halt triggered the first financial rupture. Voss Integrated Systems had already reported Q3 and Q4 production guidance to its shareholders based on the Nacogdoches site's output. Without the site, the company faced a $780 million shortfall against numbers it had already put in writing. The board convened an emergency session. They demanded answers. Raymond had none that didn't make things worse. The stock dropped 9% the first day. It dropped another 13% the second, 22% in 48 hours. Billions of dollars of market value evaporating like morning fog. Then came the SEC requirement. Federal securities law was unambiguous. A material operational disruption of this magnitude required public disclosure. Raymond's attorneys drafted the filing. It admitted in the dry, precise language of regulatory compliance that Voss Integrated Systems had been operating its primary East Texas extraction site without a valid mineral rights agreement, that the company had failed to identify and secure the legal rights holder, that this constituted a significant governance failure. The filing hit the public record on a Thursday. 3 shareholder class action lawsuits were filed by the following Monday. Then the Wall Street Journal ran it on page 1. The headline was surgical. Voss Integrated Systems faces $5.2 billion equity claim tied to founder's 1994 paperwork. The article was thorough. It explained the 1987 partnership agreement. It explained the deficiencies in the 1994 restructuring. It named Curtis Washington. It named Darnell Washington. It named Patricia Odom. By noon, the story had been picked up by every major financial outlet in the country. Raymond Voss called Gerald Pruitt 14 times that day. First Meridian Capital, Voss Integrated Systems' lead lender, did not wait for Raymond's calls to be returned. They froze a $1.4 billion credit facility pending resolution of the equity claim and the title dispute. The freeze was announced in a brief statement that used the phrase uncertainty regarding foundational asset ownership, which was the kind of language that made institutional investors reach for the exit. Across town, in Terence Price's real estate office, the dominoes were falling in a different direction. Terence's entire Gulf Coast corridor portfolio had been structured around one central assumption: that Voss Integrated Systems' regional expansion would proceed as announced, anchoring property values and driving the appreciation he had leveraged against. When the expansion was indefinitely suspended, that assumption didn't bend. It shattered. The first property went to foreclosure in 3 weeks. The second followed 12 days later. The third went to a sheriff's auction on day 60, sold for less than half what Terence had paid for it. He was personally named in 2 of the shareholder class action lawsuits, identified as the individual who had brokered the introduction between Yvette and Raymond Voss, while having prior knowledge of the mineral rights situation, a fact that created potential securities exposure serious enough that his own attorney advised him to stop talking to anyone about anything. Terence, for the first time in his life, had nothing left to say. Yvette's attorneys moved next. They had been watching the Wall Street Journal story like hawks watching a field mouse, calculating what share of $5.2 billion their client might be entitled to as a marital asset. They filed an emergency motion to freeze the equity claim as marital property subject to division. The motion came back denied within 72 hours. The Curtis Washington Family Trust had been established and filed 14 days after the Sunday dinner. The divorce proceeding had not yet produced a judgment at the time of the transfer. The assets were cleanly, legally, unambiguously beyond Yvette's reach. Her attorneys requested a meeting with Patricia Odom to discuss options. Patricia's response was a single paragraph that was so precise and so final that Yvette's lead attorney read it 3 times before accepting what it meant. Yvette's retainer ran out the following week. Her attorneys withdrew from the case without fanfare. There was nothing left to fight over. There was nothing left to claim. There was nothing left at all. Raymond Voss, facing a collapsing stock price, frozen credit, 3 shareholder lawsuits, an SEC governance finding, and a $5.2 billion equity claim that was growing more legally airtight by the day, did the only thing left available to him. He contacted Patricia Odom's office and requested a personal meeting with her client. Patricia relayed the request to Darnell on a Wednesday evening. Darnell was in his kitchen, eating leftover rice and watching the news. He listened. He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. He said yes. Raymond Voss arrived at Patricia Odom's downtown Houston office on a Thursday morning in a black car with 2 attorneys, and the quiet desperation of a man who still believed even now that he was the most important person in whatever room he entered. He was shown to the conference room. Darnell Washington was already there. Darnell arrived at Patricia Odom's office 45 minutes before Raymond Voss did. He had driven in from the 3rd Ward in his work truck, parked in the garage beneath the building, and ridden the elevator to the 14th floor in the same St. Catherine's Medical Center facilities uniform he wore every weekday of his working life. The navy shirt with the hospital logo on the chest, the steel-toed boots, the belt with the worn buckle. He had considered wearing something else. He had decided against it. This was who he was. This was who he had always been. Raymond Voss was going to look across that conference table and see a facilities manager, and that was exactly what Darnell wanted. He sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee and waited. He was not nervous. He had been nervous his whole marriage. Nervous about saying the wrong thing, wearing the wrong thing, being too much of himself in rooms that had decided he wasn't enough. That feeling was gone. It had left somewhere between the lockbox and Patricia's office, and it had not come back. Raymond arrived at 9:15 with 2 attorneys in dark suits and the practiced composure of a man who had walked into contentious rooms 100 times and won. He stopped when he saw Darnell, just for a half-second. A small, involuntary hesitation, like a man who expected a locked door and found it open. Then he recovered. He straightened his jacket. He sat down across the table and set his hands flat on the surface and looked at Darnell the way a man looks at a problem he is confident he can solve. He opened with the number. $800 million, he said, for the mineral rights. Full quiet resolution of the equity claim. Clean, fast, no trial. He said it the way men like Raymond Voss always said large numbers, smoothly, without effect, as though the figure were reasonable and the conversation were already over. Darnell did not respond to the number. He reached into the folder in front of him and placed 2 documents on the table. The first was the original 1987 Voss-Grant Partnership Agreement, the one with Harold Voss's large, looping signature beside Curtis Washington's smaller, steadier one. The second was the handwritten note on lined paper. Boy, if this ever matters, find somebody who can read what I couldn't. He smoothed both documents flat with his palm and let the room sit with them. Then he began to speak. He spoke slowly, deliberately. each sentence placed like a stone. He said he remembered the Sunday dinner. He remembered cooking for 3 hours, the oxtails, the cornbread, the collards his father had taught him to make. He remembered setting the table with the good glasses. He remembered Yvette walking in with Raymond at her side, and how neither of them spoke his name, and how Raymond had looked at him once the entire evening, once to ask for bread, and had otherwise looked through him like he was part of the furniture he himself had paid for. He said he remembered Raymond's cufflinks. He described them carefully. Gold, shaped like oil derricks, small and precise and catching the light above the dinner table. He said he had seen those cufflinks before, in a black and white photograph on his father's workbench in East Texas, from the day Curtis Washington signed a partnership agreement with Harold Voss and walked away believing he had entered a business relationship with a man of his word. He said his father had died, believing he had simply been outmaneuvered, that he had signed something he didn't understand, lost something he couldn't recover, and spent the rest of his life working his body into the ground for wages that should have been royalties. He said he wanted Raymond to understand what that meant, not as a business fact, as a human one. A man with an 8th grade education and 4,400 acres of land had trusted Harold Voss's paperwork, and Harold Voss's paperwork had been designed to steal from him. And it had worked. For 30 years it had worked. He looked at Raymond directly. He said, "You told me the help doesn't get a moment."
Raymond, your grandfather told my daddy the same thing, right before he stole his name off a company worth $29 billion. I'm not here for a moment. I'm here for everything your family took from mine. And this time I've got a lawyer who can read the paperwork. The room went absolutely still. Raymond's composure had been cracking since the documents landed on the table. Now it broke completely. The color drained from his face in a way that was almost physical, like something being emptied. His attorneys exchanged a look, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The words had landed the way true things land, without echo, without argument, with the full weight of 30 years behind them.
Darnell reached into the folder one final time and slid Patricia's term sheet across the table. $40 million as a lease signing bonus, triple-rate royalties on all future extraction, full restoration of 18% founding equity, $5.2 billion structured over 5 years. Or the Curtis Washington Family Trust would proceed to trial and seek punitive damages for 3 decades of fraudulent concealment. Raymond stared at the paper. Darnell stood up. He picked up his keys from the table. He buttoned his jacket, one button, unhurried, and looked at Raymond Voss for the last time. He said, "My daddy waited his whole life for this room. I can wait another 30 days. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and left Raymond Voss sitting in a conference room that suddenly felt very small, staring at a term sheet with unsteady hands, while his attorneys leaned in and whispered things that could not help him anymore. Raymond Voss signed the term sheet 19 days later. He signed it in Patricia Odom's office with his 2 attorneys present and his general counsel on the phone from New York, and he signed every page without looking up. The $40 million lease signing bonus, the triple-rate royalties on all future extraction from the Nacogdoches site, the $5.2 billion equity restoration, structured as a court-supervised settlement paid out over 5 years in verified tranches. He signed it all. He did not speak when he was finished. He simply set the pen down and stared at the wall like a man who had just watched something he could not get back disappear over a hill. Patricia Odom notarized every page and said thank you and meant neither cruelty nor kindness by it. It was simply done. The Voss Integrated Systems Board accepted Raymond's resignation 12 days after the signing, framing it publicly as a mutual decision in the interest of corporate stability. The statement did not mention the equity claim. It did not mention the mineral rights. It did not mention Curtis Washington, but everyone in the financial press who had read the Wall Street Journal story knew exactly what the resignation meant. Raymond Voss had overseen a 30-year fraud against a roughneck son from the 3rd Ward of Houston, and the roughneck son had won. The company was placed under court-supervised restructuring. Its future was no longer Raymond's problem. Terence Price's real estate license was suspended by the Texas Real Estate Commission pending the outcome of the securities exposure investigation. 2 of his remaining properties went to sheriff's auction in the same week, sold off at prices that barely covered the liens against them. He moved back into his mother's house in Missouri City, into his childhood bedroom, at 45 years old. Nobody in Houston's professional class called to check on him. In the circles where he had spent years performing wealth and proximity to power, his name simply stopped coming up. Yvette's lifestyle brand, the carefully curated social media presence, the sponsored posts, the influencer partnerships she had been building on the foundation of Raymond's money and access, collapsed within 60 days of his resignation. Without Raymond's backing, the brand had nothing. Without the brand, Yvette had no income. She left Houston quietly, no announcement, no farewell to the community she had spent years performing for. Nobody in the 3rd Ward noted her departure. Nobody in Riverside Terrace mentioned her name at the next Garden Club meeting. She was simply gone. Darnell Washington went to work the Monday after Raymond signed. He fixed a pressure valve on the 2nd floor of St. Catherine's that had been flagged in the weekly maintenance report. He ate lunch in the break room. Miss Claudette sat across from him with her sweet tea and her reading glasses and watched him for a long time before she finally said, "You different." Not a question. A statement of fact delivered by a woman who had been paying attention for years. Darnell told her he was going to put in his 30 days. She set her tea down and looked at him over her glasses, and something in her face moved. Not surprise, not sadness, but the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from watching someone finally get what they were owed. She said she was going to miss him. He said he wasn't going far. He was not. On the last Sunday before his notice expired, Darnell sat in his regular pew at Greater Harvest Baptist, 3rd row, left side. The congregation did not know the specifics of what had happened. He had not told anyone, and he did not intend to. But people notice things in a church community without being told. They notice when a man carries himself differently, when the weight he had been walking under for years is no longer there. Several members of the congregation stopped him after service to say he was looking well. His friend Deshawn from the choir clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Whatever you did, keep doing it." Darnell smiled and said he was just standing in what was his. The Curtis Washington Foundation was incorporated on a Thursday morning in October, with Patricia Odom serving as founding legal counsel and Darnell Washington as chairman. The Foundation's first funded initiative was a mineral rights legal literacy clinic partnering with the law school at Texas Southern University. Free counsel and education for 3rd Ward families who owned land and didn't know what they had, or who had signed something they didn't fully understand, or whose grandparents had trusted a handshake and lost a generation's worth of wealth because nobody had been there to read the paperwork. Curtis Washington had not been able to protect himself. Darnell was going to make sure someone's children could. The Foundation's inaugural board meeting was held at a conference room in TSU's law building on a Tuesday evening. There were 7 board members. One of them was a civil rights attorney named Simone Carter, who had spent 12 years representing landowners in East Texas against energy companies and had heard about the Voss case through Patricia's office before it was public. She had asked to be considered for the board. Darnell had read her resume and said yes without hesitation. She came prepared. She asked the right questions. She knew Curtis Washington's story before Darnell had said a word about it. She had done her research, which told him everything he needed to know about who she was. After the meeting adjourned, when the other board members were gathering their things, Simone looked at Darnell across the table with a directness that was not aggressive but completely honest, the way some people look at you when they have already decided you are worth looking at. He looked back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Some things start quietly. On the drive home that evening, Darnell had the windows down and the late Houston air moving through the cab of his truck. The radio was low. On the seat beside him sat the grey metal lockbox, empty now. Every document filed, every paper where it belonged, every signature accounted for, every debt collected. Curtis Washington's name was on a foundation, on a legal settlement, on a piece of history that Harold Voss had tried to erase and failed. Curtis Washington never got his moment, but he had kept the papers. He had written the note.
He had trusted his son to find somebody who could read what he couldn't. And his son had. That is the thing about still water. It runs quiet, it runs deep, and it goes exactly where it was always going. You just can't see it moving until it's already arrived. Now I want to hear from you if you had been Darnell Washington, sitting in that truck in his own driveway after everything that happened at that dinner table. Well, what would you have done? Would you have opened that box the same night? Would you have walked away entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This community always has something real to say, and I read every single one. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of what Darnell carried and what he finally claimed, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one, and there is so much more coming. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what we have lined up next will have you talking for days. Curtis Washington kept the paper. Darnell Washington opened the box, and the Voss family learned 60 years too late that you cannot steal from a man and call it business forever. I will see you in the next one.